Thanks everyone for coming out. I'm excited for this discussion. I promise I will say as little as possible and reserve things for the experts who are sitting to my left, your right. And I'm going to be pretty brief in my opening remarks, as well as pretty brief in introducing them. All of these people you probably know, their great scholarship. They don't need extensive introductions. But I do want to give a little background on how this project came to be. I am probably one of the worst people that could have put this project together because unlike many here, I did not have a close relationship with D. Michael Quinn. I was very unfortunate. I met him a few times. I was one of what I imagine many who were fortunate to receive kind emails from him from time to time with his Christmas greetings. But when he passed a couple of years ago, I felt a strong sense that something had to be done to commemorate this giant of a scholar and an important person. And then it was Maxine who reached out to me and said, we should put a conference together. And I always love when people volunteer you to put together these types of things. But it was a true honor to do, in part because everyone jumped to help at the conference. Patrick Mason with the Utah State Mormon Studies program, Paul Reeve with University of Utah, Gary with Smith Pettit, Matt Bowman at Claremont, Lindsay Hansen Park at Sunstone, the Dialogue Foundation. Everyone jumped at the opportunity to commemorate Michael because they knew that his life was worth commemorating. And the conference took place at the University of Utah a year ago, and I thought that was going to be it. And then Barbara, in all her glory, pulls me aside and says, hey, this should be a volume. This should be published as a book. And she had just become this executive director of Signature Books. And in fact, I think this was the first contract signed after he became it. So that's a great honor too. And so it was one of these works that will be a lifetime highlight for me, a career highlight to work on this volume to honor a great man and his scholarship. The way this discussion is going to go, I will briefly introduce these panelists to my left, and then I have a few questions that I'm going to ask them, and they in turn will answer each of those questions, but I only have a few, and then hopefully most of the time can be dedicated to answering questions from the audience. All right, and I'll give some instructions when we get to that point. So, as I mentioned before, a lot of these wonderful scholars to my left do not need introduction. They definitely deserve great introductions. First, we have Maxine Hanks, who is a legend of our own time, the editor of the wonderful Women and Authority, few books being as consequential as that one, and author of a number of important articles and several more coming out, I'm sure. Next to her, Patrick Mason, the Leonard Arrington Chair of Mormon History and Culture at Utah State University, author of more books than I care to mention. It's frankly embarrassing. He's putting us so to shame. Speaking of people that put us to shame, next to him is James Bergera, who has also put out a number of very important volumes, including one that just came out a couple months ago that just surprised me. Rarely are you surprised with new publications, but suddenly, boom, there's just a new James Bergera publication, which, what do you know? Another giant in the field, Marty Bradley Evans at the University of Utah, who has authored some of the most influential books on in my academic development, Pedestals and Podium. The book, remind me the title of the fundamentalists in Short Creek, Kidnapped from the Land. Kidnapped from the Land, which I recently reread. It holds up, folks. It is worthy of a reread. And then next to them, we have the future of the field. We have three students who their brilliance far exceeds their age. Brianna Bratsman, who recently graduated, from Brigham Young University. Calvin Burke, who is finishing up his undergraduate degree, and Millie Tullis, who is on her second master's degree, this one at Utah State University. All of them, they're going to produce works that are going to go up on your bookshelves alongside these other scholars. So hang on to that. All right, so enough from me. We're going to go in order from here all the way to the end. So Millie, your brilliance is gonna wrap everything together on these questions. So the first is a personal question, and which is fitting because Maxine was, of course, a close personal friend. How has Michael Quinn's life and scholarship influenced your own?
Okay, is this working? Am I on? Okay, great. Mike was both a mentor and a friend, although more like a brother than a friend, for 40 years, which meant that he taught me how to research, and he taught me how to use the archives by being his research assistant starting in June of 1986, when the LDS archives didn't allow you to research there unless you were willing to sign an agreement to have your work reviewed before it was published. Mike refused to sign, so he asked me to help him. So I was digging out all the stuff he needed so he could keep going. But more than anything, he taught me his approach to researching history as a mentor, which I would describe as fearless and balanced. Any sort, you never ignore a source. Every source is valuable. Look at all of them. Be unafraid, but also make sure that you're balancing the positive and the negative, and that you're getting making a balanced survey of resources. Also, Mike was just open. He was an open personality, and so he was unafraid to talk about anything. Mike was safe space. We could discuss any topic, any person in Mormon history, the bad, the good, the worst, the best, and figure it out together. We would talk about some of the difficult topics in Mormon history, and he would help me sort it out. So Mike, I would say, was also humble and open. He was respectful. He taught me to just let people be what they are. Don't try to edit or change or justify or solve a historical person or source. Let it be what it is. And also let it instruct you. Be open to revise your conclusions. If you find a source that completely shocks you and blows your whole theory, you got to be open to that. So Mike was just very open, humble, and balanced as a mentor. And he also, he was a good mentor because he would always scold me when I needed it and compliment me when I needed it as well. He was also a dear friend who was always there. The thing about Mike was you could call him anytime, day or night, and he was there. If you were in crisis, he was my brother. I mean, he was always there. I teased him and I said, "You're like the Holy Ghost. You're always there." And he was.
Did he go to bed at midnight?
The Holy Ghost and Mike did not go to bed at midnight. I'm afraid Mike and I were usually up till 3 a.m. watching movies and talking on the phone. But he was the kind of person who was available all the time. So Mike influenced my learning, training as a historian and scholar, and my approach. And I am so grateful that I was able to benefit from his amazing openness and balance and his compassion for everyone, every topic, every source, every person. I'm so grateful for that.
Well, I'm more like Ben than Maxine. I knew Mike, but not close in terms of our personal relationship. But he had just an enormous influence on me as I began reading in the field, and actually maybe the biggest influence he had on me is not what I wrote about in this book, but actually it was his writings about violence and the LDS churches and Mormons' relationship to violence, both in the Mormon Hierarchy series, but also he wrote an article. It was actually, I think, one of his earliest publications about the church's, what he called selective pacifism, and the church's involvement in the Spanish-American War. And that was one of the first things I read about the way that the Latter-day Saints engaged with violence and with the state. And it was his fearlessness. It was the kind of unflinching commitment to truth, to honesty. But you could always tell, and I learned this when I did meet him, but you can tell this in the scholarship, there's always an ethical core there. There's always, he doesn't beat you over the head with it, but there's a deep kind of ethical heart to his scholarship. And that's, I deeply admire that, always did, always have. And so he's been a mentor of mine, even if we weren't close personally.
it's interesting for me to think about Mike Quinn over the years, and I echo a lot of what Maxine says about him and about what he was like on a personal level. There's also, so I never had a class from Mike Quinn at BYU, and my exposure to him was primarily through his books and also through working with him later when he was publishing his books at Signature. So there's one side of him that where he represents what was the cutting edge. He was, for a period of time, he was the New Mormon history. There were other people writing, other historians, and it's kind of unfair to just credit Quinn with all of the contributions of the New Mormon history, because there were other people, but he was something else. You know, he was young, he showed well, he was articulate, he had all these things going for him, and his grasp of the sources was incredible. Nobody had been able to do that prior to Mike Quinn. So there's that side to him, that example side, the public side of Mike Quinn. The private side of Mike Quinn for me is just a little bit different. It's more nuanced and a lot more complicated. So one of the things I learned from Mike Quinn, besides what was possible in writing New Mormon history and the way that he approached it, I also learned the dangers of ego from Mike Quinn. You know, Mike Quinn did have an ego, and my experience with him is a little bit different from what Maxine said, because there were times when it was just like, it was impossible to get him to change his mind on a particular topic, especially if you could show him that maybe it's a little bit more nuanced than what you're saying. Mike Quinn was very good with the forest. He had a really good grasp of the forest. The trees sometimes were a little bit hard for him. So there is that. I did learn, I think, to temper maybe what I say and try not to be so adamant in making assertions. And I also learned that you probably shouldn't quit your job until you have real employment lined up.
That's a real lesson. That's so funny. So all day I've been thinking about this, and you know, I could say everything that Patrick said or Maxine or Gary said, but I thought I would reflect sort of differently about Michael. If I were to, you know, and I love to diagram, if I had a whiteboard behind me, I would draw a whole series of concentric circles, and it would be describing my life, but how it intersected with Michael's life. I think I first became aware of him from reading the J. Reuben Clark biography, actually. But we had lots of common friends, you know, so I cannot even remember when I first met him. I mean, surely it was in the 1970s. It was, you know, quite a long time ago. So he always was in the circle with, you know, kind of different intersections. You know, when he left his BYU job, I inherited that position, and that was an amazing honor. The classes he had been teaching, social history, community history, were all the things that I loved. So it was really natural and easy to step into his shoes. And I remember feeling like I was honoring him with everything that I did. I was really conscious of that relationship. When Gary and I and Alan Roberts edited Dialogue, I was thinking this today, that you cannot believe what a big deal it was, and you've all mentioned his books, but it was such a big deal for us to publish those really, really extraordinarily long but path-breaking articles. Do you know, and Brian Hales and I were talking about this, that so many of the big questions have already been explored and researched to death. But Michael was one of the first people who really wrote about post-manifesto polygamy, and it was a huge article, but it really laid the landscape for the work that many of us have done since that time about different aspects of Mormon fundamentalism, that really key time period, you know, between 1890 and 1910. The same-sex marriage article was the same sort of thing. I mean, it was almost a book. But no one was writing about that at that time. And it was, to say it was path-breaking. And, you know, we got really used to, in Dialogue, to being beat up about our choices. but it was so worth the risk to publish those kinds of articles that really pushed the edge on what we knew, what we had thought seriously about. And I think that's incredibly important. And then the third thing I wanted to just sort of reference, and today I was remembering a speech I gave during the September 6th couple of weeks, which was really a crazy difficult time for many of us who cared about everyone who was involved in that crazy time. And Calvin reads about it and thinks about it in different interesting ways. But I gave a speech at an event that the B.H. Roberts Society sponsored that was in the social work auditorium. I don't know if you remember that, but part of their, and you know, I remember so much of what we were talking about was how do we find our voices in the context of this religion, but also social movement around it, you know, because that's really important. And it wasn't really clear to us right now how you dissent or how you voice what you're experiencing. That's might be different from what other people are experiencing. And I remember that event was so important to me because I loved Michael, and you know, it was important to articulate that, not just Michael saying, I don't get this, I feel so beaten up and misunderstood, but those of us who cared about him, around him, saying those kinds of things for him and with him. It was really, really important. And I remember looking out in the audience, my dad, who didn't get that at all, was just sitting right in front of me in this brown leather jacket that he just loved. And I loved so much that he had come there to try and understand. And I just think that kind of epitomizes that lack of communication or understanding that is so much a part of our experience. And you know, I think people like Michael who are willing to stand up and call it differently are really important to all of us and what we do.
So, like Ben said, I am quite young, and so I never met Mike Quinn even in passing. I've read a lot of his work, and his scholarship is obviously very foundational to my own. But I would say the biggest way that Mike Quinn has influenced my own scholarship is reading his story specifically, hearing him talk about his time at BYU and the parallels that had with my own experience, because as I was writing this specific essay, I was a senior at BYU, and I was very worried that I was going to get in trouble and that I was not going to be able to graduate, and that all of those years of schooling was going to be for nothing, and that they were going to kick me out. And I'm lucky that I had a really brave and helpful advisor, but I also, as a queer student at BYU who was trying to create I was involved in campus events and queer protests and communities, and then at the same time trying to write the history and trying to capture this, you know, this weird culture and community that is BYU and the way that social movements live there, and being able to look to Mike Quinn as an example and knowing how fearless he was, and being able to see how he was going to tell the truth, and no matter what the consequences were to him personally, and he knew that his work was more important than himself, and that's something that I really admired, and that I have drawn on his strength significantly throughout this project.
Thank you guys so much for being here and for having me. So I, like Bree, I also was a queer student at BYU for for a while, and I never had the luxury of meeting D. Michael Quinn in person, but I, of course, became familiar with his work, you know, when I just kind of like woke up in the system and was like, wait, I am gay. What the heck is going on here? What is this place? Like, referring to BYU, of course, but like, when I think of Mike Quinn, I think of him as someone who specialized in resurrection. There's a philosopher named Walter Benjamin of the Frankfurt School who wrote this amazing article called Theses on the Philosophy of History, but he formulates this idea of the ideal historian as someone who makes, he says they make the tiger's leap into the past on occupied territory. And when I think of Mike Quinn's willingness to do the right thing in the face of overwhelming odds, people that did not want him to talk about these things. Like Benjamin also talks about, he says, only a redeemed people receives the fullness of their past. I think of Mike Quinn as someone who loved Mormonism, loved Mormons, and wanted more than anything for us to be willing to receive that fullness of our past, to be willing to reckon with our past, be willing to see that our mistakes don't necessarily have to, they don't have to destroy us. They can be something that we can be redeemed. We can acknowledge like the mistakes of our ancestors and their faith at the same time. I admire Mike so much for his willingness to do that. That's like someone who, I'm very gay, but I also like Mike, like some faith doesn't wash out for me. And so when I was trying to find my own pathway through spiritually, I was deeply inspired by Mike Quinn's willingness to cling to, I guess, both his spiritual and sexual orientation. So I really do like, I guess Benjamin also talks about the historian works as if they know that not even the dead will be saved if they do not do their work in the past. I think of Mike Quinn as someone who had that relentlessness, that willingness to, and I think like it's not just Mike Quinn that had that bravery, that sense of that belief, that like their willingness to resurrect Mormonism's otherwise, to bring it back. Wait, what was it like when we were okay with queerness, when we were okay with queer couples? What was it like when we did like treat indigenous people, black people differently? What was it like when we were fine with, how did we work with our polyamorous ancestors? Like, what about their faith? Didn't it matter? I think of a number of other historians that also like resurrected these bodies of our ancestors as ways to have their stories matter for our own stories in the present. And of course that's like there's a number of other folks at this table. It's like the greatest honor in the world that I can sit at a table with Maxine Hanks and my other sons like Bradley Evans and James Bergera, and just in a room filled with these people who became my heroes for their willingness to believe and to do something that mattered to them and mattered to our community. Anyways, thank you.
Thank you. I'm at the very end. Okay, I don't want to knock anyone's name plate off. Yeah, a lot of thanks, Calvin. A lot of sentiments that other people have shared have been on my mind as well. And I didn't ever meet Mike Quinn. I think I picked up and started reading Mike Quinn right before he died. I started a folklore program, master's program at USU, because I wanted to look at Mountain Meadows massacre folklore, and then I was in the archives looking at Mountain Meadows. I know we're gonna talk about it later. I was in the archive looking at some ghost stories and legends, specifically thinking about the place itself, and I found all of this weird stuff about a Logan Peepstone woman, and I remember talking to Patrick and Zooming with him and getting all these resources on what to read for and who to talk to about Mountain Meadows, and then I said, you know, and if I wanted to learn more about peepstones, like where would I start? And he gave me a bunch of great reading too, and probably recommended Quinn because I hadn't read that yet. And early Mormonism, A Magical Worldview was of course, the first step towards contextualizing what seer stones and peep stones meant in Mormonism. But what I sort of didn't expect, and what's been so generous for the last year and a half, has been turning to his footnotes over and over again. And this book is full of people commenting on his footnotes. But as a student, and as a student who also deeply loves archival work, his generosity as a footnoter, as a like, I feel, you know, and multiple places in the book talk about him gathering information, kind of knowing that other people would come along and add some more theory to it and some more contextualization, but he was doing this really, he had this outrageous talent for finding this stuff, and I feel like about everything I've written really was so much of it, even just knowing where to go to find more, really started with where the heck his footnotes came from, and I'm just so grateful for that kind of generosity that I think is so student forward and future scholar conscious, and just generous, but also just the bravery and the example of being able to talk about really difficult and painful, often personally painful and communally painful histories with a lot of love. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you. All wonderful. I feel like we're already been given a feast so far. For those of you who haven't been able to crack open the volume yet, first of all, you need to pick up a copy over there. But it's structured in three different parts. First, we have an overall introductory essay by the wonderful historian Neil Young, not that Neil Young, that really gives an overview of Quinn's life, placing it within its American context, and it's a wonderful introduction to Quinn. And then we have several parts represented by the different people here at the table. We have several essays that look at Quinn in history, looking at how Quinn represents different historical eras. Then we have a section that looks at Quinn in historiography, looking at how his work fits into scholarship that came before him and scholarship that came after him. And then we have a section, Quinn on legacy, with these absolutely brilliant students showing the directions of these questions can go in the future. So now I want to take a few minutes, and I'm going to ask all of the panelists to keep it to just a few sentences so we can get time for audience Q&A. If you could maybe summarize your chapter or the key things that you are hoping readers will be able to take away from your chapter in this volume.
Okay, what I did was look at Mike's fearless ability to deconstruct the hegemonies in Mormon history. Hegemony being the way that one perspective or story or value was privileged over another and the other was subverted. So all of his work is very deconstructive. It reveals the hegemonies in all the big topics. He tackled every big taboo foundational topic in Mormon history. And then I talk about the costs of doing such deconstructive work. And I talk about the excommunication. And the cost to his career, his life. He lost his academic career. He could never get hired again after that. And then I talked a little bit at the end about reconciliation, that he had found some reconciliation in the last 10 years of his life. But a couple of things I want to mention really quick is that, I didn't go into his personal relationship with the church. That's his story. His relationship with Marion D. Hanks, his mission president, his relationship with Spencer W. Kimball, who referred to Mike as his little Lamanite and told Mike that one day he'd be the first Lamanite apostle. I didn't go into Mike's personal relationship with the church. That's his story that you can find probably in his upcoming memoir. But I shared some things that I had observed in the ways that he had become reconciled with the church toward the end. And I also noted that he wasn't fully reconciled. He was still a heretic. And the power, at the end of the piece, I talked about how it wasn't a complete tragedy that Mike was excommunicated and lost his academic career and lived in poverty for the rest of his life. It was tragic, but it wasn't a complete tragedy. Because his outsider heretic status gave him fame, gave him visibility, and that was his power. His marginal status was his power. Mike was like a prophet crying in the wilderness, and he was powerful because of that. So that's what I tried to share.
So in my essay, I called Mike an unlikely conservative. And I don't mean that in the ideological sense. Anybody who's ever read what he wrote about conservatives like Ezra Taft Benson would know that they weren't of common cause. But in the sense, so I looked at his work on hierarchy. Of course, that incredibly influential 3-volume series, The Mormon Hierarchy. And in addition to his other work about church leaders like J. Reuben Clark. And one of the striking things, of course, he called it like he saw it, and he was able to be quite critical of decisions and actions that church leaders had made throughout church history. But he also, both explicitly and implicitly, avowed a kind of faith that God was still working through these leaders, that there was a sense that in fact they were still called. And so rather than he Calvin talked about a kind of redemption. I think a lot of his work on hierarchy is a kind of redemptive project, because I think he wanted the hierarchy to be better than it was, because he had implicit faith in its role and its calling. And I think there's a really telling moment, and I think so much of it is I don't do a whole lot of psychohistory, but this is pretty easy to do, in the sense that Mike had been told by his grandmother at a very young age that he would be an apostle. He carried that with him, and as a 29-year-old, he went to Spencer W. Kimball, who was at the time president of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles, and asked for a blessing that essentially he be released from his feelings of wanting to join the church hierarchy. And President Kimball gave him a blessing that told him he would be an apostle one day. And so I think Mike had a really complicated relationship with the hierarchy, both in terms of researching them, but also thinking, or at least having this deep feeling, especially early in his life, that they were his peers.
My essay in the book is probably one of the briefer ones, and all I do in that essay is talk about what it was like to work with Mike as an editor on some of his books, and I also try to identify what I think his contributions are, what his legacies are, and that's it.
Mine is the shortest of the book, and it's described as a postscript, and what I take on there is just his humanness.
My essay discusses the process of social change at BYU, and I looked at the parallels and differences, specifically between the way that the BYU community responded to race in the 50s and 60s, and how the BYU community has responded to queer movements in the last 15 years. And it was really fascinating. I saw from an administration standpoint that BYU has not changed. It's still the same organization, and it still uses the same practices and the same tactics. However, there was significant change in the way that faculty and especially students respond, and there's a lot of reasons for that, but students have been the driving force behind the queer movement at BYU, rather than it being an external force, and so I talk about that in my essay.
Thank you. Mine is called, I called it A Critical Counter Mythopoetics of Mormon Biopolitics. Yeah, I am an unrepentant English major. But basically what that means is I tell basically like I try to rub Mormon historiography against the grain. And I use that by doing a reconsideration of the very famous disagreement between Eugene England and Bruce R. McConkie in 1980, the very famous. And I do that partly, I think, because it's known sort of in like the popular consciousness as like, it was just this battle between, Gene, who believed that God was an eternal student, and Bruce, who didn't, and it's very different than that. I guess the thesis I kind of put forward is that Mormonism doesn't so much have a collective history as it has a collective body. To be a Mormon doesn't mean to have a certain past or believe certain things so much as it means to act a certain way, to have a body that looks in the world a certain way. And so I try to reconsider, through Eugene England's life, consider the work that Mormon historians did, especially in the New Mormon history, as like I said earlier, kind of like resurrecting these bodies of, Mormons that behaved in the world in a very different way than we behave now. And that's when you really if you just actually read what Eugene England said at BYU. His talk wasn't, sure, it talked about the idea of God progressing, but no, it was to very different ends, to do very different things. Anyways.
My essay begins with a story of Peepstone brides. Samuel Rose Parkinson, who lived in Franklin, Idaho, at some point encountered a man or a woman, depending on the version, with a peepstone. He was with his wife, and the two of them saw two young women in the peepstone that were dressed alike and knew that those would be his second and third wife when they found them. Normal marriage story. We've all had that. So really working in the vein of magical Mormonism, but a little further along the track in Utah and southern Idaho, and thinking a lot about gender and thinking a lot about folklore theories about storytelling. So I look at several different accounts of the story. Some of them are family accounts that descendants tell, and some of them are like local accounts, or there's the Fives who are folklorists who kind of composite some stories. And so I contextualize these stories and think about their similarities and differences, and to the end of thinking about the intersections of gender and divine revelation, polygamy, and sort of these magical practices, and the way people talked about them differently in 1940 versus 1978, and contrasting some of those stories.
And if you'll believe it, that's just half of the brilliant chapters in this book. There are chapters that looks at Quinn's place in the historiography of magic, on queer studies. There's one of my favorite, they're all my favorite, but one of my favorite chapters looks at Quinn's Chicano heritage and his complicated relationship to that. It's just, there's lots and lots of, it's easy to edit a volume when there's brilliant people writing for it. Now, I had one more question I was going to ask everyone, but I want to pass the time to the audience. I think it's time. I figured the question that I had them prepare for is probably going to come up in the Q&A anyway, elements of it anyway. So here's how the Q&A is going to work. Raise your hand if you have a question. I will call on you. You are going to ask your question succinctly and in the form of a question. I will then repeat the question, and I will allow the panelists to volunteer to answer it. And once I call on them, they can remember, panelists, to pull the microphone to you before you answer. And we'll try to maybe get a couple people to answer depending on the question, but we won't make all panelists respond to every question. All right, who wants to kick things off? Or have I intimidated everyone?
Don't be shy.
Yeah, go for it.
So I was wondering about, what Dr. Hanks, you said about, that marginalization, right, empowered him through it. I'm a marginalized man within the U.S. and within the church. Mm-hmm. And so I guess what about it empowered him, right? What were those experiences? I guess it's for anyone, right? You just spoke to it. But yeah, what was it about that marginalization that allowed him to then take it and craft it into something powerful instead?
All right, so the question, to repeat for our later podcast listeners, is it was directed specifically to the honorary Dr. Hanks. about how did Michael Quinn use marginalization as kind of a starter point or an influential thing in how he viewed Mormonism and his scholarship?
Well, I think his position itself was marginal because he tackled the most foundational, controversial taboo topics. You know, I mean, Mormon origins, the occult, polygamy, hierarchy, finance, gay history, women in priesthood, you know, and so his own position was coming from a place of being willing to tackle topics other people weren't willing to talk about, or tackle them in a whole new way. And so it was sort of his position and his approach that made him marginal. And he himself was marginal in every way, being a gay, Latino, scholar. And so that marginal position or approach gave his work and the topics he picked and the way he treated them by deconstructing them made his work controversial. And so it was the controversy that made him marginal because of his bravery and willingness to tackle every one of those topics and do it the way he did to reveal the hegemony. So I hope that answered the question. Anybody else want to chime in here?
You know, I think too that probably Quinn's marginalization made him sensitive to how he read sources. So I think that there were probably times when he read sources in a way that other people wouldn't have, who weren't in the particular position that he was in life. And that informed his analysis.
Oh, one more quick thing. I think also to your question, because his work was so controversial and the brethren were unhappy with it, it got visibility, and then he was excommunicated. And his excommunication made him more visible. It gave his work more power. Because when you're excommunicated and you're hereticated, so you're over here on the margins, it gives your work more power, more visibility. And so his heretic status was his power, I think.
Back.
I'm sure that Michael Quinn has a large amount of personal notes. You know, he had a note card system. I know there were manuscripts of books that got cut back significantly. He's probably got, I'm sure he's got a lot of notes and materials. Do we have a sense of what kind of personal materials he has? And are they going to end up at a university somewhere?
Sure. So the comment is on the voluminous notes that D. Michael Quinn kept throughout his decades of research, and whether those are available to us now.
I'll start and pass it to Gary maybe. He donated all of his files to Yale. And then I think he has some personal, doesn't he have, he also has his personal memoir, which went to Signature, which is being prepared. Gary, you want to add anything?
Well, actually, it's possible that the best person here in this room to answer that would be Brian Buchanan. Because Brian is in the process of editing Mike Quinn's diaries for publication. So he has been in contact with the Beinecke. And Brian might, if you want to, gang up on him afterwards, he might be willing to share some of his experiences with that. But I understand the same thing Maxine does. But the Beinecke has his papers, and I assume that whatever papers he had in his possession when he passed away will wind up there as well.
And I'll quickly add, I've done a little bit of research in his papers at Yale. Before he died, his scholarly notes were all available, and that was 80 boxes, something like that. I mean, there are transcripts of Quorum of the 12 and First Presidency minutes in the 1880s that you can't even access here at the Church History Library. So I mean, it's a wealth of resources. And now, once he passed, all his primary papers are his private papers are also available at Beinecke. To the point, to give you a sense of the scope of his personal papers in that collection, there is apparently a box of cassette tapes from voicemails left on his phone between 1988 and 1995. That you'd probably have to find a machine to play it, but that gives you a sense of what is available.
And I just wanted to point out for anyone who came in late, a lot of copies of his papers at Yale are on this back table here. I went through and pulled out a bunch. There are copies that are in our files that I invite you to come look at after. They're fantastic. I put out some really, all the way from 1972 until his death. Feel free to check those out.
Great. Yeah.
the tendency of all communities is to categorize people as either left or right or in or out. I remember a statement he made at Sunstone once at the end of a talk where he had been talking about general authorities, and no one had more reason to not have any faith in these people than he did. And yet at the end of his talk, he said, I believe, I'm paraphrasing, these men are called of God. Now, obviously that doesn't mean they get it right, but being called is one thing, and doing what God says is another thing. But it was a remarkable statement. I'm curious to know, here's a man who believed something, but was unflinching in his observation of everything about the church. I'm curious to know how you process that so-called dichotomy, or at least what we perceive as a dichotomy for most people. As you wrote about him and saw him and the way he saw the world and the church.
So the question relates to how we tend to want to place people in categories, faithful or critic, whereas Michael Quinn often fits in both. He is the faithful critic. And so the question to the panel is, how do you approach that odd and paradoxical dynamic?
I might just say, so it reminds me of, and I'll paraphrase him, what James Baldwin said. He says, I criticize America because I love it so much. I think Michael Quinn criticized Mormonism and its leaders because he loved it so much.
I'll also say, actually, at USU, in a Mormon studies group, including Patch Group, we were talking today about a very recent article called Mormon-ish, and I think that talks about, especially in online communities, but how many folks under the Mormon spectrum don't fit in that kind of binary in or out category. And there's a litany of terms, people use to identify themselves other than Mormon and ex-Mormon, and for a lot of reasons. And I think part of what I love so much about the title that was selected for this collection is because I think Quinn also is paving a lot of the way for those sort of conversations about it can be a lot more complicated than in or out, and individuals can I think also reclaim some power in terms of how they want to position or identify themselves within their tradition, within their heritage.
I also think, Mike, I think that in Mormonism, I really do think that the area of chief contestation in 20th century Mormonism is the body. I think that what made Mike dangerous, or what made people uncomfortable with him, was the fact that he refused that, this hegemonic dichotomy that's placed upon him, that because he is gay, because he is Chicano, he cannot be a Mormon. He cannot be this thing. And so I think that's a lot of what generated the controversy, was his willingness just to say, no, I reject this. I will assert my identity as a believing and faithful Mormon, regardless of the fact that some people would rather I not exist, my body, ontologically not exist, not be this way. And I personally, I admire him greatly for that. I think he's a pioneer insofar as at least my generation of queer saints feels, because I've seen and experienced some of that own pain in my own journey, that own kind of battlefield, I guess.
Do you want to say something, Brianna?
I can say something, yeah. As a lot of my work for this project was interviewing current students and past students at BYU who are queer, and the spectrum of faith that I came across was very interesting to me. There are queer students who no longer believe because of their experience as a queer member of the church, and there are students whose faith fuels their belief that they deserve more and that God loves them. And I think that, like Calvin said, Mike Quinn was really a pioneer in that thought, in being able to have such nuance, and it has inspired so many people, and I met so many people whose faith inspires their activism, and their faith really stokes the passion of who they are, and they know that they are who they are supposed to be.
I don't even really know how to say what I want to say, but I think that we're really idealizing Mike. And I think I don't remember him being an advocate. Do you know his work definitely impacted, you know, and I'm so glad that you can all acknowledge that impact. But you know, it's really like concentric circles, right? He did this, these things were done to him. I mean, there was no way he wouldn't have preferred to be in, do you know, and to think of it any other way than that. That was actually one of the most interesting contradictions with Michael, that, you know, he loved it and was fascinated by it and tried to understand it. And it's almost like identifying with your abuser, right? But, you know, so I think I actually find that the most compelling part of Michael, that he was just this human guy. You know, he was deeply conflicted, deeply scarred by so many of the things that happened to him. And then those of you who are inspired by that example become advocates and work for change and work together to make change. But Michael wasn't in the middle of that kind of activity at all. Things were happening to him, and he reacted in different ways, and we acknowledged his integrity in all of that. But you know, they're two different things in my mind. That's just kind of a dissenting view.
I recently listened to all 36 hours of a new biography of J. Edgar Hoover because I need to reconsider my life choices. And one of the points it makes is it uses Hoover to talk about the change of the 20th century and how he doesn't fit into our modern day categories of he is a staunch cultural conservative, but he's also pro-federal government power, right? That does not fit in our current political taxonomy. And I use this as an analogy to compare that, like, the category, one of the reasons why Quinn does not fit our modern day categories is because there's a historical change over the last 50 years, right? There are categories, these were more overlapping during his youth that become much, now to go off of Marty's excellent points, you're expected to be an advocate if you're working in these types of fields where you weren't expected decades ago, which I think this is a great reminder of looking at Quinn, not just as a human, not just as a scholar, but as a historical figure. Right? Marking this change over time. All right, I had a question in the back. Yep.
I think one of the amazing things about Mike, and I really loved talking with him about this, was his appreciation, even celebration of mysticism in Mormonism. Do you consider, and I say this as someone who never needed to be convinced, I've always loved mysticism, do you think his writings can and will be effective in helping shift an appreciation again of mysticism in Mormonism, that
Sure.
essential part of it?
So the question is a core drive of much of Mike's writing was on mysticism, and can we use his writing to do a new reappreciation of the mystical tradition within Mormonism? And I know there's one person on this panel that probably has a lot to say on this, but there might be others too.
Okay, I'm the obvious choice, right? But Mike and I talked about this a lot, and it's his approach. You know, his dual approach to history was praying and fasting when he started a project and asking for divine direction so that the documents he needed would come to him, which they did, and then diving in and just being so thorough that he didn't miss a single source. So he thought it was not possible to do history without relying on spiritual direction and intellectual inquiry, and he utterly unified both of those approaches. And he was fine with it. And he said, you know, I grant that my beliefs, my spiritual experiences make no sense to other people. that he said, I grant that, and I understand why they feel that way. But he said, I can't deny my spiritual experiences, and I can't deny that I've been directed to find certain documents, and I've been led to certain conclusions. So will his work continue to uphold and inspire mysticism in the church and in Mormon studies? Maybe. I think to whatever extent people see that side of his work. I mean, it's there in early Mormonism, in the Magic Worldview. It's there in a few places, but I think people would have to know how much his prayer and fasting and seeking and his personal relationship with God was absolutely a key lens and methodology for him, in order to know that the book that they're reading was produced not just by doing research in the archives. It was produced by inspiration.
Yeah. One highlight in the book, Christina Rossetti's wonderful chapter on fundamentalist literature starts out about how Quinn saw his archival finds as answers to prayer, which was
yeah, and it's so interesting, and I want to hear what Maria has to say, but I don't see it in the product, right? I mean, it's very analytical. I think it reflects his training at Yale, and that moment in American history you were talking about this, Ben. He reflects the time in history in which he was produced, the moment in history as a social historian, as an American historian, because I don't see a lot of mysticism in the writing. Even in the early Mormon, the magic worldview, obviously the topic is all about it, but the writing seems pretty straightforwardly analytical.
I saw a number of hands, but I'm just going to go with one more question because I know all of you have bedtime soon. Yeah, in the back.
If you walk into a Mormon Sunday school class, ostensibly DNC, and you mention Michael Quinn, you're going to get a lot of flack. But I've heard that there has been a publication of and by the church or two that has actually cited his works. And I'm wondering if that's true, and if it is true, what publication cited him, and what is they cite?
So it is a good fitting conclusion to kind of come to reconciliation, which is a point in Maxine's essay. The question was, most Latter-day Saints might have a negative reaction to Quinn or due to a reputation, but there's a question of whether the church has cited Quinn recently, and I'm going to turn to the panel for specifics.
Yeah, so the answer is yes. So in the Church's Gospel Topics essays, it did cite his work on post-manifesto polygamy that was published in Dialogue. And then Gary just reminded me that was it the Church News or the Deseret News, one of the two, cited him approvingly, his last book in the Mormon Hierarchy series about Mormon finances. Especially, he had a line, and I heard him repeat it multiple times, where he said basically this is a faith-promoting story. The story of church finances in the 20th century is a faith-promoting story. The church liked that quote.
Maxine, can you share what you told Mike when you saw that quote?
Oh, yeah. I said, you realize you've just been reinstated by the church without rebaptism.
At least by church PR.
He loved that, yeah.
Thank you, everyone, for all those questions. I'm going to turn the microphone over to Barbara one more time, but I want to thank all of you for coming, and I especially want to thank my wonderful contributors for making this such a joy and a true tribute to Mike. My only wish is that I wish we could have done this while he was still alive, so we could have seen how much this all meant how much he meant to us.